Hi, in this session, we're going to be talking about the relationship between society and the sacred. And so when you have a religion has to take some sort of concrete form. It has to have some sort of organizational structure for it to flourish. And so we're going to be looking at this as like the different organizational structures, how a religion can move from a new religious movement to an established religion, and some other aspects with regard to the relationship between society and religious organizations. So if we're looking at this, if you think about some new religious movements, so what are some of that you've heard of? You have the Church of Scientology, with L. Ron Hubbard in his published book called Dianetics. So that's the Church of Scientology is in the news. It's been big in Hollywood or big in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They own like half the city of Fort Lauderdale. You have the Mormons and Joseph Smith, who was a founder of a new religious movement there. You have a guy named Jesus, was the founder of a new religious movement. Jesus was born; he was actually a Jew. He was born Jewish, but he founded this inadvertently founded this new religious movement called Christianity. And so you have the Buddha who was actually raised in a Hindu environment, and so he was coming out, and so he established, again, not inadvertently established the notion of Buddhism. So, but really, when I ask you, and I want you to think about in this session is like, what would it take for you to follow a prophet? And so, one of the documentaries that you have an option of watching this session is Jim Jones and the People's Temple. And so, when I think about this, it's like, what exactly is charisma, and what because what it is like these founders of new religious movements tend to be incredibly charismatic, and they're charismatic leaders. And so you might think of a friend that you have or a family member that is just so charismatic that people just gravitate toward this individual. I've had friends like this in my life. I'm certainly not of this ilk, but where it's like if this person says, "Hey, let's go do this," like everyone just kind of like jumps on board and follows that. These people, they're natural leaders, and others gravitate to them, and actually it might actually do things against their own will, or not against their own will, but against their own self-interest, in order to follow this potential leader. And so these charismatic prophets or charismatic leaders are able to develop an initial group of followers that are bought in, that are completely bought in. And so one of the things here, it's like, okay, the idea is like, which one of these comes first? Is it belief in the message? Is it need for community? Is it need for meaning? And so who are the people that follow these charismatic leaders? Who are the people that follows these prophets? It's like, are they authentically believing in the message? Are they absent any other sort of meaning making structures around them? So they're searching for answers to questions that they don't necessarily have the answer to. And so they find it in this charismatic leader. And you see that with Jim Jones and the People's Temple. And you see that in people's need for community as well. And so we're going to look at these new religious movements. And there is a distinction. We're going to look at these distinctions between what is a cult or new religious movement, and then what is a sect, SECT. What is a sect, and how do they break off from denominations? And we're going to look at that later. So, but let's dive in with these things. So, to be human is to be a social animal, and so religion actually has to manifest itself in a society with people. If there's no people, there's no religion. So, but one of the things we want to ask is like, okay, what are the differences in the structures of society that affect religious belief, and then what structures are impacted and shaped by religion? And so we see that we looked at that earlier. We talked about Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, about how this religious ethic of this Protestant work ethic actually shaped society and laid the foundation for capitalism to flourish. So you always have this interaction, and these things they impact one another. The structures of society are impacted by religion, and they're impacted by and with religion. So keep that in mind. So one of the things I want us to think about and start here is if you look at the advancement of Christianity over 2,000 plus years, we'll see that there's roughly 30,000 different Christian denominations. And so one of the questions we want to look at in this session is like, how does this happen? How do you get these 30,000 different Christian denominations all having their single root, their single beginning in a person in 2000 plus years ago, in an area of the world. So born in Bethlehem, walking around Jerusalem, walking around the ancient lands, so in the Middle East. So how do you get it from, you have like this one individual breaking away from a previous teaching? How does that form? So then you have that one breakaway, but then over time you have 30,000 different Christian denominations. And so one of the things I want us to look at is we can actually, I can share my screen here, and I can go to, okay, we talked, so the ARDA, the Association of Religious Data Archives, we can see here, so they also have, in addition to everything else, they have some great data information, which you saw, but they have, under religious groups, you can look at religious family trees. And so this is the religious family tree. This is just the Christian religious family tree. And right off the bat with the Apostolic Church, you have different groups breaking off and kind of going different paths, all based on the teachings of Jesus and his followers. So in Jerusalem, you have the Greek Orthodox Church, you have the Armenian Apostolic, and Alexandria, you have the Coptic, in Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarchs. In Rome, you have what ends up being the Roman Catholic Church. And what you see early in the New Testament is with the letters of Peter and Paul. So the letters to the Ephesians, the letters to the Romans, the letter to the Galatians, the letters to the Philippians. One of the things that they are trying to do, Peter and Paul, who wrote the vast majority of these letters, what they're doing is they are trying to rein in, or they're trying to at least unify these different Christian denominations that are breaking off and doing things differently. And so in some of these letters, this is where you find the theological teachings about the homoousion of Christ being fully man and fully human. If Jesus Christ was more man than God, well then, let's see, if he was more man than God, well then, could he really overcome death, or is that just the act of God? If he was more God than man, did he really feel the pain and suffering necessary? So these questions were tried to be answered by the early church, and they were founded. Councils were pulled together, and you have the Apostles' Creed, which is trying to establish, okay, what exactly is this teaching of the church? You have the Council of Nicaea coming together in 325, and so they come up with a Nicene Creed. For like, okay, we believe X, Y, and Z. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to unify beliefs, because they already saw that there was fracturing. They already saw that there was a potential break of this one church founded in this one founder. And that's what we're going to be talking about. It's like, what happens when you have a one founder, and when that founder dies, how do you have this splintering of religions afterwards? And so we'll come back here. Maybe we can look at Islam right afterwards as well. And so this is just Christianity as a whole. So, but then when you get later on, when you get up to, you have the Roman Catholic Church, or, moving along, and you have the Greek Orthodox. But then when you have Martin Luther, and so you see all these different with Protestantism. And so here's the break off with Protestants in this line right here, going down. So you have Martin Luther coming in, and then you had the Reformed Church, then you had the Presbyterians and the Mennonites. And so what happened with the Protestant Reformation is you had this essentially a floodgate of, if everyone can interpret Scripture on their own, and you don't need to read it in Latin or the Greek, but you can read it in the vernacular. Everyone can interpret Scripture on their own, and so everyone has their own interpretation of Scripture. But so what you have is you have all these break-off groups, and then even if we look at, say, like the Baptist family, so in the United States, or coming to the United States, and so you have these movements here where even the Baptists themselves start splintering and breaking off into different groups. And so to where you have in 1968 the Baptist Missionary Association of America, and the Association of Separatist Baptists, the American Baptist Churches of the USA, or the Free Will. Okay, but really here's the predominant one, especially in the South, right there is this, right in the middle of the page is the Southern Baptist Convention. Um, so how is it? That's the question we're really going to be looking at. It's like, how is it that you have all of these different religious denominations traced back to one founder? Okay, so here's how we're going to talk about it. So if we want to look at two big categories, you have natural religious communities and voluntary religious communities. We're going to be focused on the second one. And in voluntary religious communities, we can break those out into founded religious communities and church-like religious communities. A founded religious community always eventually leads to a church-like religious community, and I'll walk through how that actually happens. So, but what you have in these natural religious communities, this is think back to Aboriginal times, perhaps. And so you have tribes, or maybe in South in Africa, you have tribes, or in South America, you have different tribes and people associated with a particular tribe. They're born into a tribe, and your tribe and your religion is actually based on kinship, on race, on nationality, or geography. It's based on blood. Okay? You're born into these tribes. Or if you think of ancient Judaism, you are born into a Jewish family. You don't convert to Judaism. Back in these, it is as much of a race or nationality as it is a religion. And so here you have little difference in these natural religious communities. It's not a choice. It's not a choice. You have little difference between the religious and sociocultural life of the community. Religion permeates all aspects of the society. You're born into or marry into the group, and they don't make any effort to evangelize or bring outsiders into the faith. The Amish, you could say, is a natural religious community here in the United States. And so you don't really have a lot of converts to being Amish. And they might not even welcome you into the community. And so you are born into the Amish community. And so you have to decide when you are 16, 17, 18, and you have the opportunity to go on what's called Rumspringa. And you go out and you can live the life that everyone else lives. You can use technology, use cars, live life like what are called the English. You can live life like the English. But then when you are ready, you will commit to being the Amish, and you will give those things up. You'll give up technology. You will give up electricity even. You will give up cars, and you will be part of the community. And so there is a problem in the sense with natural religious communities is that the only way they are going to grow is through birth rate. And so you have to have a birth rate that is over 2.1 in order to replenish, in order to grow that particular religion. So there are some problems with natural religious communities in the sense that they don't seek converts, but they're very insulated, very insular in the sense that they're not bringing a lot of outsiders in, and you're born into the group. You don't choose necessarily to be Amish. We can talk about other aspects of these natural religious communities with rites of passage. These are really crucial. I mentioned with the Amish, the Rumspringa. In other religious communities, you might go on some sort of vision quest where you go out and for 3 days and you have to find your way back to the tribe. For marriage, marriage is a very, very big rite of passage in these natural religious communities. You need to marry within the clan or the group, and that's one thing with Judaism in the United States is having an issue with is that you have a lot of people, a lot of ethnic Jews that are marrying outside of the Jewish community. And so that is not replenishing, especially if these children are not raised Jewish, that is not replenishing the population. Ancestor veneration is important. It coheres the group together, coheres the community together, and provides models for behavior. Typically, they can be traced back to a sacred origin, and there's always like a harmony between the divine order of things and the political order. And oftentimes it gives justification to the political order, especially if it's oppressive. And I say we're called Berger. We haven't talked about Berger in this semester, this summer session. But Peter Berger makes these claims like that the religion justifies the political order. And you find that in Hinduism with the caste system. You find it in some aspects of Christianity. And you find it in really pretty much in every religion. Where it justifies the order of things, the relationship between different social stratification structures. So that's natural religious communities. Okay, so a natural religious community, you're born into it, you don't choose it. It's typically by blood or kinship. They're not seeking converts. You have to replenish. through procreation because you're not getting these converts. Voluntary religious communities, on the other hand, is that membership is based on common beliefs. These common beliefs, they transcend the natural ties of kinship and geography. This means that you choose. I mean, it's a voluntary religious community. You choose to be a part of this religion. And so what you're bound by is you're not bound by blood, but you're bound by doctrines and ethical ties. And so there's less of an emphasis on rites of passage. They're more symbolic. In voluntary religious communities, they are not as crucial to the ongoing development of that particular individual. The religion is not sustained merely by procreation, but evangelization, proselytization, and conversion. They are out, these religions are out saying, hey, my religion is great, come join it. Okay, so they mission, they evangelize. This is not a bad thing. If you really and firmly believe that your religion is the way, the truth, the light, or the truth, then you want to tell other people that it is true. Right? And you want to invite other people in. It is a natural progression of firmly believing in your faith. And so it's something that people involved with a voluntary religious community do, is they will say, hey, I have this great thing. It gives me meaning in the world. It gives me hope. And it gives me a path to salvation or immortality or transcendence or enlightenment. And why don't you check it out? And so whether it's Buddhist, Hindu, what have you, I mean, these are voluntary religious communities that people join voluntarily. So there's two main types of voluntary religious communities. So the first type is founded. Okay, they're founded essentially by a charismatic leader or charismatic prophet. We can trace them to a founder, or a church and a church type. And these founded religious communities over time will become like the church type. And I'll walk with you how that happens. Founded religious communities are established by charismatic prophets who bring new revelations or spiritual messages. We see this across the globe, across history, where you have, whether it's the prophet Muhammad, who is receiving the Quran verbatim, writing it down. So again, and the prophet was this charismatic leader, who then brought people around him and taught them. The Buddha, again, very, very charismatic, even though he kind of wanted people to leave him alone. He was incredibly charismatic. So he had new revelations. He had a new way of trying to understand the world. So you have that. You have, one of the ones we're probably most familiar with. You have Jesus, who is a charismatic prophet, certainly new revelations. I mean, it's called the New Testament. It's the new promise, and it's new spiritual message. He says, I come not to abolish the old law, but to fulfill it. Okay, I'm not a biblical scholar, but something along those lines. So, but he's in his spiritual message is a fulfillment of the teachings of the Old Testament. Okay, and so people followed him for that. So they're typically situated, and here's the thing: these are typically situated in a previously existing religion. The leader reforms the religion with new revealed insights. Okay? And so these are not necessarily absolutely new religious movements or cults where they have no antecedent. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. But they reform, but also establish something new. The leader gathers disciples and commands them. The leader has a certain charisma, someone endowed with almost supernatural powers or qualities that can command the attention and following of other people. Charisma helps the leader spark the new movement. If you watch the documentary of the People's Temple, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, you will hear people talk, well, even with David Koresh and Branch Davidians, or even Reverend Sun Myung Moon. You hear people talk about the charisma of the founder, that they're doing things that in retrospect, they're like, why was I so convinced that this was the right thing to do? And it's because of this almost supernatural power or the charisma of the prophet, of the founder. Okay, well, here's what happens is, so you have a founder, and oftentimes this founder will be within an established religion. Okay, so this founder pulls these people along and has these people following him or her. And so what happens then when the founder dies? And this is a huge crisis, and we see this in religions, and this is what leads to this 30,000 different Christian denominations over time. Okay, is it because these questions come up? How is spiritual authority passed on? Is it through blood? Is it through some other means? And so if we go back and we can look at Islam. So I'm I'm flying by my, so we have religious groups right here. View more, let's look at Islam right here, world family tree. Okay. So you have Muhammad, then you have the Sunni. Okay, so you have the Shia, the Twelvers, and then okay, and then you have others that come along, and so and you have all these different branches and breakoffs. Okay, from the original, from the Prophet Muhammad, where the argument was over: should we be following the bloodline of the Prophet, or should we be following the teaching line of the Prophet? And it split the Sunni and the Shia up, and they are still split even to this day. Okay, so many new religions don't survive the death of the founder because of the factions that form. Originally in Christianity, immediately, actually probably even while Christ was alive, you had different factions of Christianity competing with one another and actually trying to establish themselves as like, okay, this is what Christianity really is. It's X, Y, and Z. And so you have all of these factions that show up in the historical evidence there. And I mentioned it earlier, is like you have the Gospel of Thomas, you have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you have what are called the Gnostic Gospels that were around that time, that were also trying to say this is really what Jesus taught. And so, but they didn't survive. They didn't survive past that time. And so the history is right, the records books, and so took us a while to figure out what they're actually saying. But with the death of the founder, you have the future of spiritual fellowship rest on its message and its organization rather than the leader's personal charisma. Okay, so when the founder is around, you have the personal charisma of the founder that can command this presence. And if you have a question about, oh, so what happens with X, Y, and Z, and the founder will give you an answer. Well, when the founder dies, now the only thing you have to go on is the message. You don't have that individual. You don't have that individual that you might even perceive to be endowed with some sort of supernatural power. Okay. And so what has to happen? This is where you get this notion of what's called the routinization of charisma. Okay. And this is where you're standardizing the doctrine, you're standardizing the teachings, and you're establishing the organization of that particular religion. Okay. So to survive, a religion needs to first collect and systematize oral teachings of the founder. Now, this is not something like where, okay, all these religions like have this checklist ahead of time. It's like, you know what, if we want our religion to survive, we have to do these 5 things. This is writing later on. This is Max Weber in writing in the 20th century, so 19th, 20th century. So talking about like this, like, okay, what has to happen for religion to survive the death of the founder? First thing, collect and systematize the oral teachings of the founder. Okay, so what exactly, the founder is typically not walking around writing things down. Okay, and so they need to collect, okay, what did the founder say about X, Y, and Z, and they have to systematize them. Okay, this systematization results in an official canon of sacred writings of the religion and its teachings. Okay, and this is where you get a creed or standard of belief for people to join the movement, saying we believe. That's what a creed is. It's a statement of belief. Okay, and so you find the Apostles' Creed earlier in Christian church history, and then you have the Nicene Creed later on. So established in the Council of Nicaea, what it does is it creates, okay, we took all these things together. This is what we believe, and if you're going to be part of this community, you have to believe these things. Okay. Then it has to defend itself against society and internal struggle, and this is called apologetics. Apologetics is not saying I'm sorry; it's actually defending a position. And so you have to defend itself against society and internal struggle. So imagine the whole teaching of and I keep resorting back to Christianity because it's probably the one we're most familiar with, but like one of the teachings of, oh my gosh, you eat the founder and drink his blood during the Eucharistic celebration. I mean, think of yourself as never having heard about the Eucharist at all ever, and you're early in the society, and someone says, oh, by the way, we drink the blood of the founder and eat his body. So, well, that's not exactly what it is. And so what these early groups have to do is the ritual was in place, but they have to then defend itself and sort of explain, what does the ritual really mean? Okay, and so no, and so for Catholics, it's actually a transubstantiation of the bread into the body and from the wine into the blood. For other Christian denominations, it's a memorialization, it's a representation, it's a symbol. But again, these things, they have to be defended, they have to be written about. And also internal struggle. You have constant internal struggle as well. I was like, okay, Jesus never said anything about war, or Jesus never said anything um, about a wide variety of things. And so later on, when they happen, you have like, well, okay, what would the founder have said about X, Y, and Z? And that's where you get this internal struggle. Then fourth, you have to standardize worship and discipline. Okay, these are the rituals that we're going to partake in. These are the rituals that we're going to have, and how often we have them. These are the things you have to do. To go into a mosque, you have to wash everything. You have to wash your feet, wash your face, wash your hands, because you have to be clean. So I mean, there are things you have to do, and these are all get standardized in this process, this routinization of charisma process. And then finally, the followers need to organize themselves into some sort of formal structure with clear lines of authority. Because when decisions have to be made, there has to be a clear line of authority. And if not, what happens is you have break-off groups. Okay? But what happens, like with the preacher class and the laity class, you have this stratification within the religious organization itself. Okay, so what happens over time? So you have a founded religious community that gets founded, and you have a lot of vigor within that first generation of followers, because they're emboldened by the charisma of the prophet, him or herself, and they believe all of these things fervently. They're willing to establish and take on some demands, perhaps of living on a commune or giving up everything they own, or they're willing to do these things. Okay, well, over time, and after the founder dies, okay, we're talking generations. Generations move on, generations move on, generations move on. Well, 3 generations later, they might not have the same vigor as the original group. So think about the interests that your parents have that like they're incredibly fascinated by and interested in. Did you pick those up? Or your grandparents? Like, what were your grandparents like interested and fascinated by? Are those the same interests and fascinations that you have? Okay. And so the founder dies, religion becomes organized and routinized. And what happens is like the same kind of experiences, religious experiences that second, third, fourth generation people might have. Might not be a personalized experience. And so that's what religions have to do, is they have to make it a personalized experience for those third, fourth generation individuals, to have them completely get into the religion. Eventually, disagreements rise over the interpretation of scripture, over authority, over tensions over rituals. And you see this time and time again, as these disagreements, especially over the interpretation of scriptures, or when an issue we couldn't even fathom, years ago, is now in place. Okay, what is the role of the environment, okay, for people in religion? I mean, that was not a question 1,500 years ago, and so it wasn't a question that Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, it didn't have to answer this. Okay, so should we be consuming oil? It wasn't a question, and so you have these disagreements pop up over time over the interpretation of scripture. A very, very good one in the Catholic Church was just science itself. That created a huge chasm, a huge rift in Christianity of like, was it or was it not an embrace of science, like with moving from a geocentric theory to a heliocentric theory. Okay? So over time, you have these tensions develop, and this makes church-type religions vulnerable to protest, conflict, and division. Okay? And so what do you think will happen? Well, what's going to happen is you have two options. You have either reform in the church to maintain unity, okay, where you can have this internal plurality, or you have compromise. Okay, and so the Episcopalian Church in the United States almost fractured in two over a support for a gay bishop. Okay, and so it was a question that came to the church. And the church split, or nearly split, over the ordaining of a bishop who identified as gay. Okay? So you can have a couple different things happen. You can either have some compromise, you can have internal plurality of where we're just going to shove that under the carpet and not worry about it, or what you have like in the Catholic Church is like you have like different religious orders. So the Jesuits in the Catholic Church are focused on mission and intellectualism, while the Dominicans are focused on the spiritual life. So in the Catholic Church, you have different orders. They kind of can address this internal plurality. But a lot of religions can't maintain that. And so what you have then is you have a break from a church. So if you can't reform in the church or have compromise in the church, which actually rarely happens, you get a break. And this is where they form a sect, SECT. So sects always have antecedent bodies. They always break away. That's the difference between a sect and a cult. A sect has a parent body. Okay? And so when these dissidents gain enough followers and the church does not want to compromise, there's a break from the parent body. Okay? When Joseph Smith, when he could not convince, he encountered the Book of Mormon as given to him by the angel Moroni. And so when he could not convince people in his own church that this was an authentic teaching, this was a new revelation, he had enough people, he had enough dissidents that he broke away and formed a sect, the Church of Latter-day Saints, so or also known as the Mormons. So you find this, you find it in John Wesley, and the founder of Methodism. You find it with Martin Luther. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk that he went back and he reread parts of scriptures like, this is wrong, this is crazy, and he posted his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. The church said, you need to recant. He's like, I can recant all but 13. I think it was 13. And they said, well, if you can't, you're excommunicated. He said, fine, I'm excommunicated. I'm going to bring people with me. And he did. And that was this Protestant Reformation. Okay. And so there's a couple of reasons for this. The new group discovered it in the original teachings. And this is what I was talking about with Martin Luther. Discovered it in original teaching, norms of belief and practice once delivered to the saints that are now overlooked and denied. There you have the Protestant Reformation. Or you have a second break. A new group claims new independent revelation that stands as challenge to the parent church and culture, which is Christianity. So Christianity, Jesus was the embodiment for Christians of this new revelation. It was a new teaching. But the Jewish leaders at that time, the Pharisees at the time were like, that's not Jewish teaching. Jesus like, well, it's the new revelation. And so Christianity is actually a sect. It's a Jewish sect. It's a breakaway group. Okay? And Mormonism would be the same thing because there's a new revelation for Joseph Smith. Okay, so what happens? Some common characteristics of the sect as opposed to what's called a denomination, because in a denomination over time, again, this is going to be a repeating thing, because the sect, you have a breakaway group. They have vigor, they have passion, they have these new teachings. But again, over generations and generations and generations, they tend to not be able to maintain that tension with their surrounding culture over time because of intermarriage, because of kids, because like all of these things, they become more accommodating to the surrounding culture. And so that's where you might have a breakaway group again. So, but in the end, these sects are exclusive. They claim monopoly on religious truth. They're lay organized. You don't really have, religious leaders necessarily starting sects because they're already leaders in the original religion. Voluntarism, each member needs to show some form of knowledge or commitment to be accepted into the sect. A total allegiance, are you all in? Are you with us or not? And then it's really, in the end, the sect is a protest group. And it's protesting against the church parent body and against the surrounding culture. And they actually have this tension with the parent body and the surrounding culture. Sometimes they have distinctive dress or other markers. But eventually, all of these sects lead to what are called denominations. And then you start the process over again. Over time, upward social and economic mobility of its members, and the change from voluntary membership to ascribed membership via birth. Now, I was born into a particular church. I didn't choose my religion at birth. My parents had me baptized. And so that's an ascribed membership. So when we move from, but with my kids, I was like, are they going to choose their religion? Okay. And so moving to a voluntary membership to ascribed membership will result in the sect moving in the direction of a more culturally accommodating denomination. And I talked about this. The vigor of protest is strong for the first generation, but withers away over time. The sect becomes more tolerant of other groups. There's internal plurality around. You have intermarriage. If you have, okay, well, sure, I'm 4 generations along. Um, my parents' generation, or actually my grandparents' generation, they could not even imagine a Catholic not marrying a Catholic. I mean, it was unheard of. But now, I mean, Catholics, I mean, marry whoever they want. So that's an example of this sort of like becoming more tolerant of other groups, or this generation withering, the vigor withering away over time. And eventually, there's going to be another reform movement in the church, and this whole cycle continues, and it's going to result again in a new sect or a transformed denomination. Okay, so how do we have? Okay, what about cults though? So what's the difference between a sect and a cult? Well, a cult does not have an antecedent body. Okay, a cult is also comes out of this notion, or what we call new religious movements. That's a less um, uh, derogatory name. So, but a cult has a negative connotation. New religious movement has less of a bad connotation. Anyway, so we'll talk about the cults, and these are from the chapter. There's a couple different kinds of cults. There's the therapeutic, mystical, and world affirming movements like Scientology or transcendental meditation, or you have a new age like a spiritual search for the inner self. But the idea is that cults don't happen in a vacuum. It's like what they do is they arise when there are people out there that do not find a meaning system that is answering their questions effectively. And so you have a charismatic prophet that is appealing to people that are already without, they don't have a message. It's not brainwashing. It's not brainwashing in the sense that you might like to think, or people like, oh my gosh, cults brainwash people. I mean, people willingly join cults, but they reorient themselves and they accept a new meaning system when they do it. And so there's some common new age, there's some themes in new age. You can see this in the chapter. Kind of talked long enough already about this, but we're going to have you watch, you're going to watch a documentary on one of those new religious movements. I'm going to have some discussion questions that's going to count as class course credit or course grade. And yeah, but this is how we go from, in Christianity, how we go from one movement, one person, to over 30,000 different Christian denominations over the globe. But whew, that was a whirlwind. All right, I'll talk to you soon.